Welcome, everybody. I'm John Christman. I'm a professor of philosophy and director of the Humanities Institute at Penn State. And it's my pleasure to introduce Carolyn Chen, who's professor of ethnic studies at the University of California in Berkeley, and the author of numerous works, including Eat, Pray, Code, When Work Becomes Religion in Silicon Valley. So welcome, Carolyn. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
So I thought we would begin by just giving a very brief overview of the main orientation of the book.
Yeah, so what I argue in my book is that that work is replacing religion in Silicon Valley. So my study is based on 5 years of ethnographic fieldwork and over 100 interviews with tech workers, executives, human resources professionals, executive coaches, meditation and mindfulness coaches, like the people who also service the tech workers. And it's a study of Silicon Valley work culture. And in it, I argue that work has replaced religion for them. And by that, I mean that tech professionals are looking to work to fulfill needs for identity, belonging, meaning, purpose, and even transcendence. These are the very needs that Americans at one time looked to faith institutions and religious institutions to fulfill. The other side of the story is that workplaces, companies are now using spirituality as competitive advantage. And so they're bringing spirituality into the workplace by, for instance, bringing meditation and mindfulness, bringing in spiritual and religious leaders to speak and give inspirational talks.
How do these trends go together? That is, long and more of a sacralization, if we can use that word, of the work experience.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And so first, let me back up and say that while this is a book that is based on a case study of Silicon Valley, I believe that my findings are generalizable to other knowledge industry hubs, and also that many of the trends that we're seeing in Silicon Valley really are trends that we're finding among all professionals in the United States. And that is really about the changing meaning of work that we really see starting in the late 20th century, around the 1970s. And as you pointed out, what's happening in the late 1970s is that we see that high-skilled workers start to work more and more hours. And traditionally in the United States, it's those who are less educated who work more hours, and those who are more educated who get to work fewer hours. But we see this interesting change in trend starting in the late 1970s. So work becomes more demanding in terms of one's time and energy, but it also becomes more demanding in terms of one's devotion. But the other side of the story that I think that we don't often recognize is that as work has become more demanding, it's also become more giving, in the sense that work has changed so that it's fulfilling more of our needs, not just our material needs by giving us a paycheck, but also by fulfilling our social and spiritual needs. So for instance, if you look at most Fortune 500 companies, they all have a mission, an origin myth, an ethics, and even a charismatic founder, many of the kind of basic elements of religious organizations. What companies have found is that when their workers are align their deepest parts of themselves with their company and their work, they're also more engaged and they're also more productive.
Do you think the breakdown of community connectedness and neighborhoods and religious participation in one's neighborhood has driven the trend you're analyzing, or is it a draw from new modes of corporate organization that are kind of trying to bring workers in and make their lives meaningful?
Yeah, that's a great question. The other part of the trend is the decline in civic participation and also the decline in religious participation. What this is really a story about is this shift in where people find meaning and belonging. So it's both the expansion of work institution, and what I mean by expansion is that it's taking up more time, energy, and devotion in the lives of people, but it's also fulfilling more and more of their needs, you see? So it's that expansion, and then it's also the contraction of these other institutions, such as faith communities and civic organizations, that would also fulfill those needs too. So you need to see it as a story of both and.
Can you talk more about this attraction to Buddhism in quotes?
There's a regional story here, which is that the tech industry grows in the Bay Area at the same time as the counterculture. And so many of sort of like early founders, like, Steve Jobs, Larry Ellison, these are people who were involved in the counterculture and, made trips to India and were very interested in Asian spirituality. The story of the Bay Area is that those folks who were at the margins and part of the counterculture, that they actually become part of the elites of the Bay Area come the 1990s or the 2000s. I talk about how in the Bay Area, there's sort of this ambient Buddhism around where there is this presence, there's this sort of background presence of meditation and Buddhism that's just sort of part of the air. And that when something becomes part of the air, it loses its religious quality in the sense that it's distinctive and it starts to feel secular, right? Universal or ubiquitous or invisible. That's what I mean by that. It has now become a therapeutic practice, a wellness practice, which is also commodified too.
Toward the end of your book, in the last chapter, but it really you're building up to it throughout, you talk about the techtopia.
Yeah, so I end the book with a chapter on techtopia. I offer that concept of techtopia as a social critique. Um, and techtopia is what I call a society. Well, here I'm using kind of a play on words, an engineered society where work has become the highest source of human fulfillment. And, when I was in Silicon Valley, everyone was sort of like, well, this is a win-win situation, right? People are productive, companies are making a large profit, and they're happy, they're leading meaningful lives, and they have purpose, and they are, they seem fulfilled. So what's not to like about this? And when I was in Silicon Valley, I turned this over again and again in my head because I would go to these companies and I would be able to get free lunch, and I also meditated with them. And I often thought, I would love to have this too. Like my life would be so much better. I'd be on my fifth book by now. I'd be on my sixth book by now, right? I'd be so much more productive. I think the late capitalist promise of work is like you get all that and you live a really meaningful and fulfilling life where you feel like you've changed the world, where you've contributed to the world and you're someone. And I think that there's something very, very alluring and very attractive about that. But what I argue about Techtopia as a kind of social ecosystem is that what happens is that the workplace operates like this huge, powerful magnet, and that basically attracts the time and energy and devotion of the people in the community. And it does it to such an extent that all the other social institutions, and these are faith communities, these are the Rotary clubs, these are the arts organizations, the sports leagues, the family, that these grow weaker and smaller in comparison. And that in order to fight for a share of the time and energy and devotion of the community, they end up having to service the workplace. For instance, I interviewed one Buddhist priest who told me that people were not coming to his zendo anymore because for their morning sittings because they were too busy working. So he got a bright idea, which is that he would bring meditation to work. But when he brings meditation to the workplace, he has to shorten it. He also has to take out the ethical teachings because he's not being brought there to teach Buddhism. He's being brought there to teach a productivity tool.
So I wonder if you have any thoughts about the politics of it, both its ideological tenor, but also its effects on the democratic culture that we might want to protect for other reasons.
You know, what was really interesting is that when I talked to some tech workers, I asked them about their civic participation. Have you done any, volunteering, any kind of anything like this? And they would say to me, yeah, actually, I did it through the company. What happens then is that the company gets to choose. What that does psychologically is that it actually creates tighter bonds of dependency and intimacy with the company so that it makes you more engaged with work. Do you see that? So there's that is problematic. So, I mean, I'm not suggesting that people hate their work or I'm not suggesting that, workplaces don't think about these things. But instead, what I'm suggesting that is for like a healthy kind of social ecosystem is that you need to have a community's time, energy, and devotion more equally distributed among different kinds of institutions that have different ends, right? That might have different ethics, that might have different values, might have different logics and different ways of contributing to the community. Otherwise, what we have then, everything really becomes essentialized and boiled down to the bottom line, in some way feeding Google's bottom line.
Well, Professor Chen, it's been fascinating talking to you, and I look forward to your visit where we can talk more and hear more from you about these topics.
Thank you. I look forward to visiting as well.